In our previous video, we were talking about the importance of an inclusive corporate culture in order to develop and sustain a diverse and inclusive workplace. So let's dive a little bit deeper into organization or corporate culture. So in our previous videos, we talked about organizational structure, right? We talked about departmentalization, the level of specialization. We talked about centralization, formalization, chain of command, span of control, all those things that make up the organizational structure. And then in previous videos, we talked about human resource management, and we talked about motivating and leading our workforce. So the other piece that we want to look at here is organizational culture. Organizational culture is the shared assumptions that affect how work gets done. So this is how people perceive, think, and react to events. It is organizational culture combined with structure and human resource management that is ultimately going to look at how we actually implement the strategies we have for our organization. So in our next couple of videos, we're going to talk about developing an organizational strategy, figuring out who we are as an organization. But once we've developed that strategy, implementing it, turning it into actual performance is going to depend on the structure of our organization, how well our people are motivated and performed, and organizational culture. What are the shared assumptions that we have? What is it in terms of how people perceive, think, and react to events that's ultimately going to determine how that strategy gets turned into performance. So it's how we understand why the company is doing what it's doing. It is passed on to new employees through social norms, through mentoring. And so organizational culture is important, whether we're talking about diversity and inclusion, whether we're talking about in terms of effectively implementing some of our strategy. So we need to look at then as we think about the corporate culture, how do we change it? So what if it's not what we want? And what kind of corporate culture might you want? So whether you're leading a company or whether you are deciding where to work, what kind of organizational or corporate culture are you seeking? So if you're following along with Pearson Rebel, we are doing in the Robbins textbook, we are doing a company cultural assessment. So it asks you some questions, and we're trying to figure out then what type of corporate culture you most align with. And so it identifies 4 types of corporate culture: collaborate, create, control, and compete. And I think there's a bit of an error in the software here because the pie chart doesn't match the rest of the information. It looks like it's labeling on the pie chart control what should be compete, and compete what should be control. So if you are doing the survey as well, take note. I think the pie chart is pulling the wrong information. So we'll just use the summary data here. So we're looking at what type of organizational culture is most important to you. This work here in terms of this survey actually aligns with Quinn and Cameron's competing values framework. So I'm just going to go forward to the competing values framework slide here. And it used some slightly different language. So we're just going to toggle back and forth between. So Quinn and Cameron's competing value framework identifies 4 types of corporate culture. One that it calls clan culture, one that it calls an adhocracy, one it calls market, and one it calls hierarchy. So when we talk about clan culture, this is an employee-focused culture valuing flexibility, not stability. And so if you're doing that Pearson Rebel survey and you came up with collaborate, then you fall into this collaborate, into this clan culture. So here you're looking for an organization that helps you provide a sense of identity. It makes you feel like you're part of the family. So it's really about cohesion, empowerment, participation, feeling part of the group. That is going to be more flexible and internally focused. Now, it's possible when you did the Pearson-Revel survey, you came up with a more create in terms of yours. So if I'm just going to quick toggle back. So we talked about collaborate. And so you can see that one I'm ranked second on that one. And this one here is in terms of create. So create, if we translate this into the Quinn and Cameron's competing values framework, this is the adhocracy culture. This is a more risk-taking culture. It's going to value more flexibility. This is where we value innovation, coming up with new ideas, being adaptable, creative, agile. So if you are looking for an organization that is willing to experiment, that encourages some risk-taking to try new things, that is more innovative, that would be the corporate culture you're looking for. So in Pearson-Revel survey, you'd be more create, or in the Quinn and Cameron's competing value framework, you're what is called an adhocracy. Then we have what Quinn and Cameron call market. And so market is going to be what you find in the Pearson-Revel survey in terms of compete. So here in terms of my score, I am highest in compete. So this is going to be an organization that values efficiency, productivity. It is looking for how can we outbeat the competition. Right, so we are focusing on that performance and on how competitive we are as an organization. And so if we go back to Quinn and Cameron, you're focused on profits and meeting goals of the organization. So more customer focused, more productivity focused. It's focused on increasing market share, increasing profitability, and obtaining the goals of the organization. My life in economics, in operations management, in stats, it's all about productivity and efficiency, finding better ways to do things, more efficient and effective ways to do things. And so definitely I live in the culture of more of a compete, enhancing that competitiveness. The last one here we have from Quinn and Cameron is the hierarchy. And so if you are doing the Pearson-Revel, just quick scan back, then you are more compete. Okay. And so, sorry, not compete. You are more control. And so control is about clear policies, clear rules, steps and procedures for doing things. This is going to be an organizational culture that is focused really on stability. So we'll go back. Quinn and Cameron call this the hierarchy culture. And so this is really going to be about consistency, smooth functioning, timeliness of our operations. If you are more of a culture that is control or hierarchy, you like stability, you like standardization, you like more formalization, so more process, rules, clear expectations in terms of what you should do and not do. So the Quinn and Cameron competing values framework comes from Robert Quinn and Kim Cameron. They are management professors at the University of Michigan. What they looked at is that culture shapes employee experiences. And so the corporate culture needs to align with what individuals want in terms of the culture that they value in order to get them to be engaged. And so the emphasis here is that leaders and managers, which is what we're looking at in this topic, is the role of the leader, is that you need to understand the culture in terms of the expectations of your workers. What kind of culture are they looking for? And is there alignment with the culture of the organization? All right, so one thing that's interesting here as we look at the Pearson-Revel survey is that you can see at the bottom here, it will compare your results to different industries. I'm just going to move my head over a little bit here. And so if you're trying to decide, what kind of industry am I going to work in, it's interesting to note that different industries focus on different things. So Government organizations are very much about standardization and stability, and so they are much more of that control or hierarchy in terms of the culture. So you can see here government is primarily control. Tech manufacturing, create, right? So there's a need for that innovation if you're working in tech. You can see data systems firms is much more compete. So we can actually look at industries as well as individual companies to look at what type of culture dominates. And of course, it makes sense, right? If it's an industry where you need to constantly innovate and come up with new ideas, then it's going to be create. If it's about growth of the organization and fighting for market share, it's going to be more compete. And if it is going to be more of a nonprofit government type organization, it is going to be more control. Remember, our perspectives we're looking at here are very North American individualistic. As you look at foreign companies, looking at what country and national culture, you're going to see more of the collaborate. As we look at the organizational culture, we recognize the distinction between national culture, which we talked about in our previous videos, right? Those are the values we learn as a child. We learn from the people around us, set by the country or the society we're a part of. Whereas corporate culture is based on practices that we learn on the job. So if we are leading, managing an organization, it's much easier to influence corporate culture than national culture. So we might change our leadership and management styles based on the national culture. But when it comes to corporate culture, then as leaders, as managers, we can influence what that corporate culture is. So we need to recognize there are levels of culture. There is the observable. So when we talk about this is the physical manifestations of culture within our organization. And so this would be things like how we dress. Are you expected to wear a suit and tie at work? Can you wear shorts in the summer? The stories we tell about the company and about the people who work there kind of set this expectation in terms of what it's like. We can talk about the ceremonies, the recognition and rewards we give. Those are observable levels of culture, showing in terms of what we value, showing in terms of the belief, perspectives, in terms of how we respond to events. Now, there's another layer of culture. So these would be more of the values and the norms. So here, not explicitly stated, but the behaviors of management set a baseline in terms of the behaviors of the rest of the organization. So this creates the values and norms within the organization and defines the culture. So here we have, how does management act? How do they behave? How do they respond to particular events? And then the third level of culture is the core values of the organization. So here it's much harder to kind of pinpoint, provide a name to what this is. But what it is that it does influence decisions. So these are the assumptions that we make when we make decisions within the organization. They are a deeper level, a reflection of the culture, just by the assumptions that are made in terms of that influence the decisions that are made. So culture can be observable. It can be mirroring the behaviors of management in terms of the rest of the workforce's values and norms. And it can also be in terms of what influences the decisions that we make within the organization. How can you convey or change the culture? So we convey the culture through slogans and sayings. So at Red Deer College, our slogan used to be, when you get here, you understand. The idea is that we may not be your first choice, but when you get here, you realize how great you are. Well, this has an impact then on corporate culture because we're not trying to be the best. We recognize we're not the best. We recognize we're not even your first choice. So that changes our behavior in terms of how we compete. That changes our behavior in terms of how we recruit. And it also changes the perceptions and attitudes of the students in terms of what it is to be a Red Deer College student, right? So are you saying by being here, you're not the best student? But we value something else. We value the relationship, the community that we are part of. Rites and rituals. What do we do on a daily basis? What kind of behaviors do we have? That then sets the culture. What kind of stories we tell. So if your fond memories of individuals and things they said or did really sets, what is the culture within the institution? Are the fond things you remember things where, group got together and played a prank? So maybe you're MIT. If you're at MIT, one of the things the freshman class does is they put on pranks, so rites and rituals. And then the legends at MIT become these stories of what different classes did. One group took an individual who was about 5 feet tall and they measured the length of the bridge that's right next to MIT. And so I think his name was Smoot. They measured him, they measured the length of the bridge in him. And so they've actually marked the length of his body all the way across the bridge. So what do these stories, legends, and myths tell you about the culture of MIT? Fun, joking, creative, and there's always a prank, good-natured, where people are showcasing their skills and talents, coming up with unique ideas. So it's setting a culture for the organization simply by the stories we tell. You can also develop culture in terms of how your leaders react to crisis. Do you have a manager, a leader who, when something goes wrong, is just constantly swearing and having a meltdown inside the office? Maybe that goes viral. That then sets expectations and norms for how everyone else responds. Do you have a leader that when something goes wrong, they're very adept at spinning it and using it to their advantage? How your leaders react to crisis will determine how well the rest of your organization responds. It sets the company culture. Role modeling, training, coaching sets expectations in terms of behavior. Even how you lay out the facility sets an expectation for culture. So if you have a location where it's a lot of closed doors, then there's an expectation that people get their work done and they don't do a lot of interacting. If you have a facility, we look at places like Google when they built their big hubs in California, they expect you to live there. They expect you to interact with each other. So there's a lot of play space. There's places to eat, to work out. Why? Because the culture is that people are constantly interacting and collaborating, but the people also put in a lot of hours. And so that location then becomes kind of everything to them. Place you get your dry cleaning, place where your child gets childcare, place where you eat lunch and dinner, place where you spend your downtime. So we can transmit and develop the culture based on how we set up our organization. What we reward, what we promote people for, the goals that we set, and how we assess people's performance will all indicate what we value, and so become part of the culture. How do we measure performance? How do we measure how well we're accomplishing our activities? How much control we have in terms of micromanaging? How much centralization? How much formalization? So those organizational structures in terms of chain of command, those things determine the culture. Is it an organization where it's more collaborative, more team-based? In which case it's not very high, it doesn't have a whole lot of hierarchy or centralization, it's much more flat. And then how much rules do you have? What are the procedures? If people are supposed to be creative, then you have a lot less formalization, a lot less procedures. So how we set up our organization, how we model it as management, the decisions we make how we react to crisis, and those more social aspects that we encourage or discourage all convey to others who we are and what we expect from each other. So we can develop and influence the culture within the organization.